And what's up, everybody? Welcome into the Rath Learning Curve for today. And we're going to talk about the top 5 college football offenses this year for DFS Fantasy College Football. We're going to run down the teams that you need to definitely know, be aware of, the skill position guys. And then also I'm going to talk about a statistic that I look at in terms of, kind of where to go and how to look at these players and something that you might not have considered. So let's start with the first team. And the first team that we're going to talk about today is going to be the Ohio State Buckeyes. And we're going to talk about their offense. Now, the quarterback situation, they actually have 3 guys that could potentially play. We have Braxton Miller, who got hurt last year, who was a phenomenal player in 2013. Then we also have J.T. Barrett and Cardell Jones. Now, J.T. Barrett had a phenomenal season last year until he got hurt at the end, and then Cardell Jones played at the end. So quarterback battle between Cardell Jones and J.T. Barrett. It sounds like Jones is in the lead. So the thing you got to know about the Ohio State quarterback is they're very fantasy friendly in that this is an offense where the quarterback runs quite a bit and the running back runs quite a bit as well. So they're going to want to run the ball down your throat. That's kind of, Big Ten style. And they're going to play strong defense, and they're going to murder people. This is the number 1 team in the country, and they're going to run the ball down your throat every single game, and they get an opportunity. So, lots of rushing yards. One thing you're not going to want to do is do not take the quarterback and the running back on the same team because it's going to be counterproductive. Now, you got to kind of, just play the matchups and probably lean more towards the quarterback would be my opinion. Ezekiel Elliott is the number 1 running back for Ohio State, and while he's good, he represented 40% of the rushing yards last year. It's still, I think, going to be a situation where you're always going to have to pay a hefty price for Elliott, and you're never really going to know when he's going to go off. So the thing about Elliott is, I just would proceed with caution a little bit. More of a tournament play for me, but the Ohio State quarterback, whether it's Jones or whether it's Barrett, is definitely going to be somebody you're going to want to look at in all formats. Now, on the wide receiver side, you got Devin Smith that went to the NFL. He represented 25% of the receiving yards last year, and that's something that I look at. I look at what percentage of the yardage did a player account for, and that's going to determine me, where I go and what kind of strategy. So Devin Smith represented 25%. Michael Thomas is back. He represented 21%. So you got to expect him to go up. Jalen Marshall only 14% of the total receiving yards last year. So I think he's a guy that you want to look at. Now, early on, what's going to happen is a lot of these teams that have powerful offenses, if they had a number 1 wide receiver graduate, the number 2 goes to number 1 and probably has stats from last year. So you're not going to get a ton of value on them. Here's where you're going to get value. Is that number 2 wide receiver. Is a guy like Jalen Marshall is probably going to be very low priced early on in the season. That's where we're going to be able to take advantage. Now, we did talk about Braxton Miller is going to move from quarterback to H-back, so we'll see how that plays out with their offense. The tight end position is one in college that's not used very much. However, Ohio State does have a pretty good tight end in Nick Vannett, somebody that you're going to be able to use week in, week out. Again, it's all going to be price dependent on a player like that because they're going to just ground the ball out so much. Vannett's a guy that's probably going to be used more in the red zone when they get more 3rd and long situations. So you could see where Vannett may not get a ton of receptions but could be a touchdown machine. Let's move on. Also, real quick, one of the things that you want to take advantage of and take notice of is how many offensive linemen are returning as starters. So for the Ohio State, they got 4 offensive linemen returning, which is huge. The next team that we're going to talk about is probably, right there with Ohio State, and that's TCU. Now, their quarterback is probably going to be the number 1 guy that you're going to want to use week in, week out, but he's going to be expensive. That's Trevin Boykin. Trevin Boykin put up was basically, monster passing and rushing, accounted for over 40 touchdowns last year, 26% of the rushing yards on TCU. So again, he was just an absolute monster, and they've got all 5 offensive linemen coming back, I believe. So something that, this team is really, really loaded. The running back there is Aaron Green, and he only represents 33% of the rushing yards because Boykin gets so much. But he was pretty good last year. Problem with Green, is you just can't use him with Boykin, so you got to make sure that you just separate those guys. All three wide receivers are back, and a guy that I made a lot of money on last year when no one had heard of him early on was Josh Doctson. He represented 24% of their total receiving yards for TCU last year. Here's where the value – now, Doxson's going to be expensive. Here's where I think there's potential value. Colby Listenby, 18% of the total receiving yards last year. Deontay Gray, 14% of the receiving yards last year. And while defenses are focused on Doxson and Boykin, I think Listenby and Gray could be guys, depending on what their price opens up at, could be extreme values, especially in blowout games where they're going to take Doxson out and then run with some of the second and third guys. So that's my take on TCU. Third offense we're going to look at is Baylor. And new quarterback there at Baylor, Bryce Petty had been there for quite a while. This is a powerful offense, puts up one of the most, top 10, top 5 in scoring pretty much year in, year out. Seth Russell is a guy that inherits a quarterback position, and you might get a little bit of value on him because he didn't have a ton of numbers last year. So early on, we might see value on Seth Russell, and that's going to disappear quickly once they start putting up pinball scores. So Seth Russell, they're going to throw a ton. Now the running back here, Shock Linwood, represented 44% of the rushing yards last year. So he's a guy you can absolutely want to get in. And Johnny Jefferson is the backup. He got 18% of the rushing yards last year. Somebody you definitely want to keep an eye on. If something were to happen with Linwood and Linwood went down with an injury, or he just wasn't going to play, they pulled him from the game, whatever, that's going to be a guy who could represent some huge value. So Johnny Jefferson is the backup running back to Shock Linwood at Baylor. Baylor bringing back a pretty good wide receiving core. Antoine Godley's gone, but Corey Coleman at 24%, KD Cannon at 22%, and JD Lee at 13% of the total receiving yards. So we got a trio of wide receivers coming back. Coleman and Cannon kind of would go, split every week, but Coleman was the guy that was ahead of him. So that's definitely somebody. And they're returning 4 offensive linemen, so that's good as well. Now, moving on, the next offense we're going to take a look at is Oregon, who always has a powerful offense. But I think this year, they're retooling, they're reloading, a lot of new names, a lot of new faces, especially starting at the quarterback position where Marcus Mariota was the second pick in the draft. So we're going to look at Vernon Adams, who's a transfer from Eastern Washington, who we don't know if he's going to start because he's got some academic issues he's got to get cleaned up. And Jeff Locke, who was there last year. The Oregon running back typically represents 20-25% of the rushing yards, so there's going to be huge value. And we know that high-octane offense is going to run a ton of plays. Royce Freeman, the number 1 running back in Oregon, represented 39% of the rushing yards, so he's always a guy you can look at. Here's where the problem lies, is Oregon wide receivers are going to drive you nuts. They spread the ball around so much that it's really hard to pinpoint. Byron Marshall was at 21%. Dwayne Stafford was at 14%. The guy that I think you can look at that could present some value is Braylon Addison, who was hurt last year and didn't play. But in 2013, he had 24% of the receiving yards for Oregon, and he could be very low priced early on in the season because he didn't play last year. So Braylon Addison's a guy that I'm definitely going to keep an eye on. The last offense that we're going to take a look at is USC, and they've got their quarterback is a passing quarterback by the name of Cody Kessler, who had a phenomenal season last year, and he returns coming back. Justin Davis is the running back there. He only represented 28% of the rushing yards last year, but that's because Javaris Allen, who went to the NFL, got drafted by the Baltimore Ravens, was 70% of the rushing yards. So they do like to lean on one guy. They do have Trey Madden there, who played there last year, and they have a freshman named Ronald Jones. So I think Justin Davis is a guy you definitely look at who's going to get the lion's share of the workload for USC, and that could be a guy that represents value. Wide receiver Nelson Aguilar graduates to the NFL. He represented 34% of the total receiving yards for USC. So Juju Smith is a guy that's going to step up, and I used him a lot last year, and because he was so cheap and he came through. He had 90% of the receiving yards last year. Expect that number to go up. Now, the rest of this receiving core is kind of unknown, but it is highly touted. And again, this is where I think when we watch position battles, we're going to find extreme value on the USC wide receivers. Stephen Mitchell, Darius Rogers, and Adoree Jackson are all guys that I'm going to keep an eye on and see who's going to be the starting wide receiver opposite of Juju Smith, and that could be the guy that represents huge value. Hope you guys enjoyed this top 5 offenses for college fantasy football. Check out some additional videos where we cover running backs and wide receivers, and also some of the mid-majors in college fantasy football this year. Thanks again.